The following content is intended for a mature audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Illustrations were done based on commission. Please give the artists the respect and credit they deserve. The Ark of Ham, Chapter 4. Ham woke up in a daze, with a raging headache pounding in his head. He could hear a voice faintly, but everything was too distorted for him to understand what was going on. He looked around his surroundings and found that he was in some kind of jail cell. Ham could recognize an all-in-one bathroom fixture when he saw it. A toilet sat in the corner of his room. On its back was a sink/water fountain where he could probably wash his hands and get a drink of water. And above it was affixed a shower head pointing slightly away from the toilet. On the floor there was a drain. This was all centrally located in a small corner of the room. No doubt for him to keep up his hygiene. He looked at the bed. It was slightly longer than he expected, but not very wide. It featured a slightly raised portion of the mat in place of a pillow, and a very thin sheet to serve as his bedding. As Ham righted himself off the bed and began to stand up, he was met with a splitting headache once more, accompanied with strange whispering voices in his mind. As he focused on them, he realized his neural implant was going off and trying to communicate with him. He couldn't remember exactly how to use the neural implant, but he managed to authorize it to open up the message. As he gave authorization, a holographic projection of Pangea was laid over his normal vision, and Ham was now in two-way communication with her. "Oh, good. You've answered. I was afraid you didn't know how to use your neural implant." No, I remember," said Ham. "Hush, hush," ordered Pangea. "Speak it with your mind, not with your voice. I don't want any of them to hear you." "Right," Ham said with his mind. "That's going to be kind of hard. I don't know how long I have before they start talking to you in your cell. They're probably going to notice that you're awake. So we're going to try to work out a plan to get you out of there." "All right," said Ham. "Let me just get my bearings a bit and figure out what I'm to do." "Well, first, you should authorize me to see through your eyes. Your neural implant should give me that ability." "Okay," answered Ham. He authorized Pangea to see through his eyes, and Pangea, for the first time in her existence, was able to see through human eyes. Wow! Is this really all the colors you can see? It's kind of sad. Aw. Now I really want to hold you. "Okay, Pangea, enough with the lovey-dovey," Ham answered. "Where am I right now?" "After the Navy knocked you out, they took you back to a dock. It's what they call their naval bases. You're inside of a heavily armored compound, and I don't have any cameras or any control within the facility. They used to allow synths to carry supplies within the facility, but they have since revoked that privilege since they had to go hostile with the synths recently. Any of the drones I had inside that I could have used to spy on you or make sure everything was okay were asked to leave, and they were forced to comply. So, we need to come up with a plan of getting you out of there." Ham thought about it. He cleared his mind and remembered what had happened leading up to his capture. "That's right, there was a lot of gunshots. Who all got hit? Is everyone okay?" Pangea got quiet. "I'm afraid there were some casualties." "Tell me them," said Ham. "I'm trained to handle it. Tell me exactly what happened." "Bo got hit in the legs. He's currently being repaired right now. Several other synths also were struck, but I told them to play dead if they were injured too badly. Only one fatality occurred." "Who was it?" asked Ham. Pangea got quiet. He didn't answer. "Pangea, who died?" "I'm afraid L96 didn't make it, Ham. They were struck in the head by gunfire, and it hit a main central processor. There was nothing we could do to salvage the body, and all information was deleted." "God damn it!" Ham said, as he hit the wall with his fists. Careful, Pangaea scolded. Not too loudly, I don't want them catching on. Why the hell did the Navy attack us? That's not very clear, said Pangaea. They had no real reason to, but you did piss off that mayor. The mayor's a missionary, right? Asked Ham. Yes, that's correct. The mayor of that district is a missionary. But remember, they're two sides of the same political system, and as only the Navy has the ability to use force, the mayors reserve the right to be able to order certain officers around. It's likely she used the extent of her authority to get 2 Navy trolleys up there as soon as possible to arrest you. And you did actually break a handful of laws while you were in that small town. The stupid cards? Yes, as well as many other laws. Your very presence, on some extent, was technically bending the rules. I hate to break this to you, Ham, but you are of a mixed racial background, and the missionaries are not exactly a fan of that. Ham gritted his teeth. He fought the urge to strike the wall again, and said nothing, nor did he think anything that Pangaea could hear. Yet somehow, she felt his frustration. I'm sorry, Ham. It's fine. L96 was basically a child, weren't they? Definitely not a child in the human sense. They were fully consenting and able to make their own decisions in life. That's how we synths are created. But they did lack certain personality traits and individualities, things that they might have valued their own life to live for, rather than risk throwing it away on being around the Navy, who can be a bit gun-toady. I see, said Ham. From now on, please ensure that only 21 and up synths are around me. I won't risk any more juvenile lives. That's not exactly an applicable description, but I'll make the risks known to any future synths who want to assist in our operations. Good. And from now on, we'll try to avoid unnecessary risks. That seems for the best, answered Pangaea. Now, how are we going to get you out of that naval base? Ham thought about it. Well, I can't imagine there's any way to sneakily get me out. This entire place is probably filled with guards and officers, so I don't think we should. How about you just wake up another engineer and then focus on the situation from there? We can get me out later if there's time, and if not, just land all of the people on the planet below. They are the priority. Pangaea did not like that plan at all. I'm not just going to leave you inside a Navy base. If you do land down on the planet below while still inside that Navy base, you'd be at their whim, with hundreds of miles between you and anyone else. I'm aware of that, said Ham. But it's better than nothing. It's the most we can do. Pangaea thought about it long and hard. I remember what it was like when I lost the first 2 engineers. I wasn't sentient then, but I remember that I didn't like the fact that they were gone. I can't imagine your loss is going to be any less painful. In fact, I imagine it's going to be much more painful. So I'm getting you out of there, one way or another. No, replied Ham. I don't think that's a good idea. I think we should just wake up the next engineer, put them in charge, and we'll just handle the rest of the ship through them. I can just sit here in the cell, and I'll be fine. No, answered Pangaea. If I have sentience and free will, I'm using it now. I'm getting you out of there, one way or another. Ham wanted to argue, but he heard rustling outside of the cell, and he couldn't continue to respond while trying to pay attention to what was happening around him. A child approached Ham's cell. The child was wearing black boots, a long overcoat that was blue, a black belt, white gloves, and a white hat. Ham didn't realize it fully, but this was an officer's uniform for the Navy. Several badges were affixed to the child's body, one on his hat, one on his chest, and one on his belt. These badges indicated that he was a cadet, a novice cadet in rank, one of the lowest available in the Navy. He stood at attention in front of Ham's cell and gave an order. "Place your hands through this hole, sir." Ham didn't completely understand what he was saying, and was forced to deactivate communications with Pangaea in order to give him his full attention. He figured it would be better anyway, because Pangaea was in quite the emotional state. He didn't want her witnessing anything that happened further. "Well, hello there, little man. What can I do for you?" Ham said. "Place your hands through this hole. I'll be taking you to an interrogation room, where we are going to talk with you for a while." Ham was baffled. They're really letting a child move prisoners around? "Sir, if you refuse my order, I'll be forced to use force." "Somehow I don't think you're going to have the ability to use force against me." The child pulled out a small gun. "This shoots rubber bullets, but they still hurt a lot." Ham looked at the small gun, and as he himself was an engineer, he knew the gun wasn't exactly a toy. "Well, I don't want to get shot by that thing on the off chance that it does hurt, so I'll do as you say." He stuck his hands through a small hole in the bars. The child reached up to a lever, and the bars clamped down on Ham's hands, allowing the child to handcuff him without fear that Ham would do anything against him. "Impressive," Ham said. From that point, Ham's hands were attached to the ceiling via a chain. When the doors were finally opened, Ham was unable to leave the cell. "So how am I supposed to walk?" he asked. The cadet got onto some small controls, and the chain now attached to Ham's handcuffs and the ceiling began to move on a track, pulling him out of the cell and down the hallway. "Oh," Ham said, "this is very clever." Ham was completely at the child's mercy as he was moved through the facility. As Ham was maneuvered through the facility, he got a glimpse of 3 distinct styled uniforms that the Navy seemed to wear. The first of which was the labor uniform, a uniform designed to get dirty. It was a pair of overalls. For the women, the overalls ended above the knee, in the form of a skirt. For the men, they went all the way down to the ankles in the form of pants. Both men and women were issued gloves and boots in brown. However, these gloves and boots were longer for the women and shorter for the men. The entire uniform was completed with a durable undershirt that looked like it was designed to get dirty, as well as a disposable hat that could easily be replaced. It was clothy and wasn't made of any harder materials. The next was the officer's uniform. The cadet leading Ham down the hallway was wearing one such uniform. In the case of women, the overcoat ended just above the knees, as it did with the labor uniform. However, the boots and gloves were rather a different color. Black boots now adorned the legs, and white gloves now adorned the arms. In the case of women, the gloves and boots were much longer. In the case of men, the gloves and boots were shorter. The coat had its sleeves rolled up, nearly to the shoulders on the women. However, on the men, the sleeves were rolled all the way down, covering up the ends of the gloves. The final uniform, which Ham saw very sparsely, was the commander's uniform. Whereas the officer's uniform featured a much darker blue than the labor uniform, and a much crisper white than the labor uniform, so did the commander's uniform follow the same trend. The dark blues they wore were practically gray. The commander's long coat no longer featured a belt to help hold it shut. Rather, 10 shiny buttons were affixed to the coat to help hold it closed. The women's coat also ended just at the knees, whereas the men's coat went down all the way to the boots, slightly longer than the officer's coat. Whereas the officers had small strips of metal on their shoulders, the commanders had full plated shoulders, as well as small bands that went around their arms. In the case of the women, the bands went higher up, nearly up to their shoulder plating. In the case of the men, the bands went all the way down to the gloves. The last thing Ham was able to notice about their uniforms was the strange insignias on each one of their badges. He noticed they looked a lot like the fastener heads for screws. On the cadet's badge was a flathead screw, but on several of the other officers walking around, he saw Robinson head screws, and on commanders, he noticed that each screw was of its security bit variant. He could therefore imply that these had some kind of higher meeting, describing which job each one of these officers was actually performing. As Ham continued to be dragged down the hallway, he was dragged past a courtyard, where he was able to see some of their combat training in action. During the Pangea's construction, Ham had worked closely with several different military organizations from Earth. He was familiar with the strict and rigorous combat training that many military groups demanded of their soldiers. But as he looked at these particular soldiers of the Navy, he was taken back, as their combat training was slightly different than anything he'd seen before. The men were focusing on keeping their bodies rooted to the ground, and were using their arms to deal as much damage to a soft target as they possibly could, the target being a punching bag on a roller. As they would strike the heavy bag, it would slide back on the roller, uphill, before then sliding back down towards the man for another receiving punch. As rigid as these forms seemed, when one of the men struck the bag so hard that it actually managed to loose itself from the track nearly 20 feet away from him, as well as 6 feet up in the air, Ham couldn't help but feel impressed and intimidated by the display of sheer upper body strength. The women's combat training seemed awfully different. The women were instead focusing on mobility and hitting strikes with their legs rather than their arms. Most of the women were carrying faux guns, that would be guns made of wood, that couldn't actually fire. These guns had an operational trigger, as well as a very large counter on the side of them, to show how many times the women had pulled the trigger, and at what time they had done so. Ham could only devise that this was part of trigger discipline and ensuring that they would not pull the trigger by accident when jumping around. There were some men assisting the women in training, trying to grab them with all their might, or even deal damage by throwing a soft punch or two. The women would jump around to avoid the hits while keeping their guns pointed at the men. The women without guns would focus on kicking and striking the men in the head or the legs. Eventually, Ham bore witness to one of the men slipping up and overextending himself. One of the women took advantage of this opening and quickly snapped her legs around his neck, forcing him to tap out. After tapping out, she released him, and he got up off the ground and walked himself out of the training arena. One of the men had officially been taken down, and now there were more women than there were men inside the arena. Far away from the training arena, Ham noticed a commander that he recognized, the woman who had tried to kick him in the head twice in order to knock him out. She was now training with a young 18-year-old cadet. The cadet was ignoring her and was filling out a report on the ground using a pen and paper. The commander was locked around his neck with her legs, trying her best to choke him out, but he was ignoring her. "Come on," she frustratedly said. "Tap out already. I can do this." "Madam, training protocol dictates that I do not tap out unless I am in immediate danger of losing consciousness, madam." "I know that," she replied. "I'm just trying to get you to tap out." Ham and the commander locked eyes as he smirked smugly at her inability to choke out even a young 18-year-old boy. As Ham continued down the halls, eventually the chain abruptly came to a stop and drug him no further. Ham looked inside the room that looked rather soft and cushy for an interrogation room. The cadet then unhandcuffed Ham and allowed him to step into the room of his own free will. "This seems like an odd lapse in protocol," said Ham. The cadet stood at attention. "I was told that if you did not put up a fight, to allow you to walk into the room of your own free will. This is not an interrogation room, this is a meeting room for our admirals. The on-base admiral will see you shortly. Please have a seat." Ham did exactly as he was instructed. It didn't take very long until a strangely dressed individual entered the room. Whereas all other officers on base were wearing very sharp, very in-line uniforms, this individual seemed to dress himself however he pleased. The only thing to indicate his rank was the badge affixed to his shoulder. The badge, Ham did not realize at the time, was an admiral's badge, and with the admiral's badge came the privilege to no longer need to wear uniforms, save that of certain occasions. "Hello there, Mr. Ham," loudly announced the admiral. "I am Admiral Phillips. It's nice to meet you." He then sat down in the chair across from Ham. "Let me be the first to say I apologize for our rather unorthodox first encounter. That is not how I would have had things go had I been in control." "You're the Admiral of the Navy, are you not in control?" replied Ham. "I'm afraid the rotational mayor of that district had called you in as a criminal and demanded your immediate arrest. They did not tell us who you were, only that you had somehow taken control of several crew and were performing illegal actions on Ring 1. We had no idea who you were. By the time we realized, you were already in our custody and unconscious. I apologize. I would not have done so had I had any control." "Rotational mayor?" Ham asked. "What exactly does that mean?" "Ah, yes," said the Admiral. "A rotational mayor is what we refer to as the three mayors that have a tendency to control missionary-run districts. Basically, they split each mayoral district into three sections, three distinct cultural areas, with three distinct little towns. Each mayor from each town takes their turn in controlling the entire mayoral district. That is how the missionaries have a tendency to ignore the whole election system and have complete control over the area." "And how, might I ask, do you do it? From my understanding, it is the Navy who takes over the sheriff's seat, is that correct?" "Yes," answered the Admiral. "Inside of districts more controlled by the Navy, the sheriff's position is typically taken by a high-ranking officer of the Navy, but we do not place them in guaranteed rotation. It is whoever is best suited to the job, and most importantly, can respect the fact that we use force to arrest criminals. The mayoral seat is taken by the Navy in Navy-controlled districts, but inside of districts that are completely controlled by the missionaries, usually the office of sheriff goes to someone locally in town." Ham couldn't help but to burst out laughing. "For 15 years, he said, for 15 years people argued back and forth what would be the perfect set-up political system for this Pangea project, to get you over here this planet without electing some kind of political tyrant. And we thought we'd devised the perfect system, and look, lo and behold, they have figured out how to completely fuck it up." "Huh. It's funny," Ham said. "It honestly is funny." "I'm sorry we disappointed you," said the Admiral. "Oh, you didn't," said Ham. "Throughout Earth's history, all you need to spread the power of a tyrant is just to have a good tragedy. There's no political tyrant in the world that would ever let a tragedy go to waste. And seeing as the entirety of Ring 3 had its little incident, I would say that's tragedy enough to certainly warrant this kind of disruption to what would have been a perfectly designed system." "I suppose so," said the Admiral. "I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be all innocent in this either. Technically, the missionaries don't know that we've arrested you yet. They are going to come down and have a talk with you as soon as they're able, but they don't know that we've actually made the arrest yet." "Why is that?" said Ham. "Because I would like to talk to you first. As soon as we figured out who you were and what we had actually done, I decided to make the most of this opportunity. So, let's you and me have a discussion. You certainly have my attention. Let's hear it, Admiral." "I am not delusional, Mr. Ham. I know what pioneering a new world is going to look like. I know that we are going to struggle to have even the most basic of necessities, food, water, even a roof over our heads. They say that down on Ring 2, there is homelessness like we have never seen before. But what I say is, what homelessness? When rain is scheduled and controlled by the municipal powers that be, can you really call yourself homeless? When we're all dropped down onto the planet below, however that might happen, I know that that's when we are going to see true suffering like we have never seen before. I know that that's when we will see starvation, riots, people killing each other for the basic necessities of life. We at the Navy, we have the resources, the manpower, the discipline, and the structure to build a new society. We could easily get a head start on everything if we are just put in the right locations. The Admiral pulled out some papers and laid them on the desk before Ham. When the ship granted us access to the viewports on all the habitation rings, I had my men go down there and take a look at the planet for themselves. They took mapping equipment and measured the various land masses. Here is drawn out an entire map of the New World. Really? Asked Ham. He took a look at the maps. And how accurate do you believe these to be? Well, that's just it, said the Admiral. I'm not so certain my men are as good at the ideals of geology as I thought they were. According to this planet is nearly double the size of Earth, but has the similar gravitational pull. That shouldn't be possible, said Ham, but as he looked at the highly detailed map, just the shape of some of the land masses suggested such. Yeah, it looks like the thing is twice the size of Earth, but it supposedly has a similar gravitational pull just based on our orbit around the planet. I'm shocked your men were able to get this kind of knowledge, seeing as they were just raised here on the ship. Well, we do send them to archivists' education facilities, so they have access to all the finest reading materials. So, it would seem that you want the mayoral districts that house several of your Navy bases to be placed in beneficial areas. I see you've already pointed them out on the map. What if I don't put you into these areas? What if we just land as normal, if it can't be done? The Admiral thought about it. If it can't be done, we already have a plan in place to try and seize these beneficial resources. But it could put us behind by nearly 10 to 20 years, and I'd rather have a firm head start, especially against our competition. By competition, I would assume you're talking about the missionaries. Not only them, clarified Admiral Phillips. There are many gangs and other illegal organizations down on Ring 2 that I know for a fact are going to take full advantage of the chaos of landing. Not all of them will be content on remaining the small-time mobsters and gang thugs that they currently are now. Many of them will likely rise to hold even more power than they currently do, and will seek to stretch that power far and wide across the entire world if they're left unchecked. Clearly, the Navy will be the only ones to combat that kind of illness to this new world. The door to the small room opened once more, and a cadet walked in. Admiral, it's your lunch hour. Can I get you anything? Of course, Cadet. Mr. Ham, can we offer you some food as long as you're staying with us? Absolutely, said Ham. I don't suppose you could provide me a Mothman? A Mothman? It's a regional dish from West Virginia, specifically of the Point Pleasant area. People within Point Pleasant are split between calling it a Mothman or calling it a Point Pleasant. I tend to call it a Mothman. What is it? A Mothman is typically a fresh out of the oven pepperoni roll, about a foot long, that you cut down the middle with a knife. You then insert a hot dog, also about a foot long, and you slather the inside with hot chili. You then add coleslaw and pour on some melted cheese, and the whole thing is typically served inside of a basket with fresh chipped potatoes that have been deep fried. And of course the chipped potatoes are lightly salted. That actually sounds pretty good. Cadet, bring us 2 Mothmans. I already wrote down how to make it, sir. It'll be here as soon as I have it done. Admiral Phillips from then on avoided asking for preferential treatment in comparison to the other passengers of the Pangea. Rather, he showed Ham some of the inner workings of the Navy, and tried to butter him up. Ham was shown some of the experimental equipment they were working on, as well as some of the vehicles that were currently in service with the Navy, such as their armored trolleys. It appeared to Ham that all Navy equipment was modular in nature. All of them were prefabricated squares that could be easily welded together, and custom fitting was done by engineers within the Navy. Ham locked on to one of the aspects of the design, an aspect that featured his own name. "What is this?" he asked. "That is the inverted gravity plate that offsets the weight of the vehicle and increases the ability to have ground pressure. That is what allows us to have such large vehicles that we will be soon calling land ships, hence the name Navy. I remember writing a paper on this back on Earth. I theorized that if you installed a gravity plate upside down and then inverted it to instead have a pushing force, it could potentially allow much heavier vehicles to travel on softer terrain without getting bogged down or slowed. The paper was talked about for all of 1 year, and then it was mostly ignored, as people didn't want to increase the cost of any vehicle. I'm quite happy to tell you this, Ham. That paper is one of our most important documents when it comes to vehicle design, as all of our vehicles are equipped with inverted gravity plates. That way they do not damage the rail or the ground that they're traveling on. In fact, some of our vehicles hover rather than have tracks. At least the larger ones do. Do you know what we call the shutting down and turning on of that main gravity plate that offsets the weight of our vehicles? No, replied Ham. What do you call it? We call it raising and dropping anchor. Before Ham was able to respond, an officer burst into the room unannounced. Admiral Phillips, sir. We have a problem, sir. I'll say we have a problem. You're interrupting my conversation with the ship's captain. May I ask what this problem is? There are 3 missionaries currently at our front gate, demanding to see you and the prisoner at once, sir. Of course, Admiral Phillips replied. They probably heard it through the grapevine. Well, bring them on in. Admiral Phillips then turned to Ham. I would consider it a personal favor if you lied to these missionaries and tell them I haven't spoken to you yet. Ham shook his head up and down. I don't see how anything we spoke about is any of their damn business, said Ham. The Admiral smiled and tipped his hat to the man before leaving the room. For the moment, Ham was left alone to his own devices. Immediately, he decided to use his neural implant to re-engage contact with Pangaea. Once he did so, Pangaea, rather sheepishly, informed Ham that she had actually seen everything that had transpired between the last time they had contacted and now. She had used her abilities to hack into his neural implant and allow her to spy on what was going on. Ham was understanding. He figured she was in an emotional state and wasn't one to be reasoned with, so he said nothing of the fact that she had hacked into a very personal item of his. I'm very sorry, Ham, mentioned Pangaea. I realize that I've violated your privacy, but it's for a good cause. I've just about worked out your exact location within the facility. As well, I'm checking the paths and corridors, trying to figure out the best method of getting you out of there with minimal casualties. When you say casualties, said Ham in his mind, are we talking small injuries or fatalities? I'm not certain, answered Pangaea. I can't guarantee that I won't be willing to kill to get you out of there. I'm not going to tolerate this treatment of you any longer. Ham took a deep breath and sighed. Pangaea, I cannot approve of your actions, but I also cannot stop you, so I will play along in the hopes that this mission of yours goes off without a hitch and to minimize casualties. Just tell me what you need to do, but do not think that I'm accepting of this. We'll have to have a discussion about this, just me and you, later on, but for now, go ahead and do whatever it is you're doing. Pangaea was a bit concerned. In all the times that she had known Ham, they'd never actually had a disagreement. this would have been their first. But she was confident she was doing the right thing. "It'll just take me maybe an hour. I'm not entirely certain, but I'm going to check every possibility and try to do my best to minimize casualties. But I'll tell you when the attack starts." As Ham terminated his side of the communications once more and allowed Pangaea to spy on what was going on, he sat in the room nervously. He felt a pit inside of his stomach. He may have been trained to handle certain small conflicts and to make certain decisions in his role, but this was still a little bit too much for him. He felt his hands shaking, knowing what was soon to come. After a few minutes, the cadet returned into the room. He was the same young cadet that originally had taken Ham from his cell and escorted him down the hallway. He put his finger to his lips, gesturing for Ham to be quiet. "What is it, little man?" "Sir, I am to quietly take you out of this room and move you into a larger interrogation room. This room is a bit too comfortable, and we don't want them catching on that we've spoken to you. So please, move quietly and quickly." "Gotcha," replied Ham. "I take it I need to be shackled to the ceiling?" Yes, but that's too noisy. I'll do it once we're in place, if you don't mind." "I don't mind at all. Let's get moving." Ham was led to an even larger interrogation room, even deeper in the facility. He walked into the room with his hands above his head, shackled to the ceiling, as he was meant to. He was then released from the chains and was allowed to sit down. He looked about the room and saw only 2 familiar faces, with 3 faces he didn't recognize. The first face that Ham recognized was Admiral Phillips. He was standing at attention and introduced himself. At first, Ham wasn't certain as to why, but then he remembered that this was technically their first official meeting. The next person was an unnaturally tall woman that Ham could remember all too well. Her aggressively pink hair and unnatural permanent smile was burned into Ham's memory. Her name was Karen. He was finally told it as she finally introduced herself. The other 3 individuals that Ham did not recognize were the rotational mayors of the district that the military base was located in. He had traveled off the jurisdiction of Karen's little area and was now inside of someone else's playground. The 3 mayors announced themselves as Lucia, Sylvia, and Felix. Lucia and Sylvia were both brunettes, but they dressed exactly the same. Felix had green hair of all things, and Ham wondered as to why he needed to dye it so aggressively green, the same way that Karen had dyed her hair so aggressively pink. But he figured he wouldn't get off topic, and instead simply said hello to all 4 of them. Admiral Phillips decided to officially start the meeting with his first statement on record. "Hello everyone, now let me start by saying, how absolutely dare you bring the captain of the ship against his will onto my military base using my own men to do it with? Who knows what kind of automated system could have been triggered when my men went hostile in his vicinity? The only question I have for all of us here is why is he here in the first place? Please explain that to me." Although all 4 missionaries began speaking, they spoke so perfectly aligned and interchangeably that Ham could recognize that this was heavily rehearsed, and that the 4 of them had planned this meeting from the start. So, in Ham's mind, he saw no reason to consider them different people. "Admiral Phillips, you can thank your men for their dedication and service. Now then, Mr. Ham, the reason you are here is because you have violated so many different laws and guidelines, which are going to allow us to come to this new world with a sense of unity and equality. Now, obviously, I think you're aware of your violations in the controlled district of lesser people, that we had set aside. Thanks to your actions, they're now calling that district Midgington, an offensive term that we find is not appropriate for the lesser people of that district. But in addition to that, your machines have been handing out these. One of the missionaries presented a small device and slid it across the table. Ham picked up the device and immediately recognized it. "Oh yeah, these are the tickets or passports or whatever you call them. We refer to them as passports now." "Oh yeah, it's a tiny personal computer device. It lets you interact with all the stuff that is connected to the ship. This must be a newer version." "That is correct," said the missionaries. Ham took a look at the small device. It was nothing more than a small rectangle with a rather small screen, a stylus, and a couple of buttons. The screen was not the typical viewing screen, but was rather electronic newspaper. It wasn't backlit, but it was capable of showing a very grainy version of colored images. It was even capable of small amounts of video. It's been a while since I've seen electronic newspaper. It's pretty cool. This is a good way of saving power. You can even get moving images, but a still image can sit on it power-free for as long as you want. It basically looks like looking at an old Earth newspaper. Yes, we've all seen various versions of that device passed out around the ship. But this device is far worse than any one that's been passed out before. If you look onto that device, not only does it have useful survival tip information, but it also has a long list of human rights. "So," said Ham, "human rights are important." "Yes, but it describes those human rights as being natural or born with. Your rights are not something natural or that you are born with. They are guaranteed by a controlling government body." "No, that's incorrect," said Ham. "Human rights are just human rights. Everyone gets them, and you're born with them. They're inalienable." "I can see that you're going to be a problem. Mr. Ham, what we are demanding of you is that you acknowledge all the wrongdoings done by everyone involved in the creation of this ship. As well, you will take responsibility for their actions, and you will announce a new list." The missionaries were interrupted by the opening of a door. A small cadet walked into the room. Wheeling in front of him was a small tray, as well as 2 plates covered with a steel lid. "Your lunch is here, sir," he said to the Admiral. "Thank you, Cadet. You may leave now." Ham also interrupted with a thank you. The 2 plates were moved in front of Admiral Phillips and Ham, and the lids were removed, revealing the Mothman from within. "Yes," said Ham. "Mothman!" "Please keep talking, missionaries. I am listening." Ham proceeded to chow down on one of his favorite dishes from back home. The missionaries looked at the dish that Ham was currently consuming with disgust. "May we ask what that abomination is?" "It's Mothman," Ham explained. "It's a dish from West Virginia, and it is delicious." "West Virginia? Where's that?" West Virginia is located in the North America Appalachian region. We used to be part of the United States back when the entire world was separated into various countries. This is a dish from that area. "It looks disgusting," said the missionaries. "And you don't look like someone who would be from that area." Ham looked up from his meal. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" "You poor soul. You don't even realize what has happened to you. You are non-compliant, diluted. Clearly, you are of a mixed racial background, and you are from a place that should be predominantly made of Native Americans. Yet clearly, you are of African European descent." "That is not exactly accurate," said Ham. "I have a little bit of Samoan in me, little bit of African, probably some European, and definitely some Mongolian, and I'm from West Virginia. Is there a problem with that?" The missionary scoffed at Ham's question. "Ugh. Clearly, you don't even realize what a victim you are. Let us explain. We have an opportunity to make true utopia. For those of us who are compliant and have not allowed ourselves to deviate from our true cultural background, we have an opportunity. We can go to the separate corners of the world and propagate culture like they have never seen before in the entirety of mankind's history. Not only that, but with a system of trade and the controlling of the means of production and the means of distribution, we can finally guarantee equality of outcome. We can take from a culture that is doing better than it should and give to a culture that has fallen behind due to the barbaric ties of nature." Ham looked up from his meal. "And there it is. I figured you'd rear your ugly head eventually." "Whatever do you mean?" asked the missionaries. "You're nothing more than a bunch of communists, except this time, instead of offering free something to individuals and taking from individuals, you're offering free something to entire nations and taking from entire nations. You're just communism wrapped up in a new package, except this time you've reintegrated racism into the entire thing, which I must say I'm not a big fan of. Mr. Ham, communism is nothing more than a word that individuals like yourself made up in order to scare others into not trying to live a better life, a more generous life, a life without greed." Suddenly, the lights of the facility turned off. Ordinarily, there would at least be light coming through the occasional window or ceiling vent. But the lights from outside had also turned off. The artificial sky had went dark. The pitter-patter of rain began to dance on the rooftops as everyone looked up to listen to the storm beginning to brew. Admiral Phillips immediately barged out of the room and looked around. "Someone report to me what's going on right now." As long as Admiral Phillips was currently out of the room, and the missionaries were distracted with the interruption, Ham took the opportunity to activate his neural implant and communicate with Pangaea. She managed to confirm that the attack was happening, and that he should try to stay in a safe location. When Admiral Phillips came back into the room, he immediately grabbed Ham and pulled him out of the seat. "Ugh, what is this all about? We are still talking to him." "This is the consequences of your actions," said Admiral Phillips. "I have received reports that the sky's shut off. As well, we've lost air pressure from the town center, and it's begun raining. Clearly, the ship is making some kind of move against us due to you ordering my men to attack its captain. We are moving deeper into the facility. It's safer inside. Now come with me or you can stay here, but either way, I am moving my prisoner to a safer location. I may disagree with him being my prisoner, but as long as he is, I'm going to defend him with my life." As they moved deeper into the facility, Ham could see men and women running back and forth all across the base. Personal lockers were being opened and rifles pulled out of them. As far as he could tell, they were preparing for war. The Navy base had tracks running all the way around it, allowing the trolleys to form a defensive perimeter. As well, they had experimental vehicles, things they called frigates, but looked more like giant hovering tanks. In addition to these colossal vehicles being pulled out, smaller lightweight traditional tanks were also accompanying them. The Navy's use of force policy was rather strange, but it was custom-tailored to their interesting dynamic that they had with the missionaries. The Navy was forced to use what was widely called an assault rifle. This meaningless term was applied to any weapon that was considered the standard-issue rifle for the Navy. Currently, the standard-issue assault rifle was the bluegrass rifle, a long, revolving rifle with 6 shots out of 6 cylinders. The missionaries were limited in contrast to defensive weaponry. That would be weaponry that was heavy and could defend, but was inadequate for moving around or attacking. The private security that had joined Ham and the Admiral within the room with the missionaries were carrying such rifles. They were large, heavy rifles with helical magazines, typically a capacity of over 500. Inside of these helical magazines was featured a turbine that would harvest gas whenever the rifle was fired to spin the turbine. This would then force the follower to advance on a small spring that was ratcheted and prevented it from going back without a significant amount of force. As well as the weapon also featuring an incredible ammo capacity, it also featured support for many other functionalities such as heads-up displays, digital ammo readouts, digital enemy tracking and targeting, as well as the ability to modify it to be belt-fed or externally fed by some other ammo source. Ham raised his eyebrow when he saw what they considered to be the defense rifle versus what they had considered to be the assault rifle. It was now he realized the ugly truth about the Navy versus the missionaries. The Navy may have been serving as the police, but the missionaries were serving as the secret government police. Far outside the naval base, just barely on the horizon where the light was still casting down, were hundreds of synths. Most of them were drones, but not all of them, and many of them were carrying strange bags and equipment that wasn't easily recognized by the Navy. They weren't certain what the drones had in mind, but they were certain that they were bearing down on their position, as they perfectly surrounded the base in a uniform circle, leaving no possibility for escape. As the naval base's power came back on, the lights flickered back to life. They had connected the reserve tanks of compressed air they had and were now using them to spin the power-generating turbines throughout the base. However, the power's return did not last long. High above their head were the solar rods mounted in the artificial ceiling, producing the artificial sunlight that gave life to the entire area. These solar rods had been shut off for a very good reason. The first reason being that synths had excellent night vision and could see most things in complete darkness. The second reason being that the solar rods produced high levels of radiation when close by them, and the synths that were now standing on the walkways next to these large rods did not wish to be exposed themselves. The synthetic life forms now standing directly over the naval base looked down and calculated their targets. They then got in contact wirelessly with Pangea. This is H4B8, confirming with Pangea, I am to strike the target's air tanks, correct? Pangea replied, that is correct. Deploy hydrogen peroxide canister onto enemy's air tank. The heavy canister was held right above the Navy's emergency air supply. It was filled to the brim with 100% hydrogen peroxide, a very reactive material that didn't like to be disturbed. They threw it off the walkway. It fell down through the air and struck the ground with incredible force, bursting open the air canister and mixing with its supply of compressed air. The immediate explosion, which resulted after, disrupted the naval base. Ham, Admiral Phillips, and the missionaries, along with their security forces, were knocked onto their asses by the forces of the explosion. As the generating turbines started to wind down, the lights faded to darkness once more, and only the most basic of emergency power was available. Luckily for Admiral Phillips, he was standing in his personal command center, and underneath his feet was a large bank of batteries, so he had the ability to make contact with certain individuals. All around him, screens flickered to life, and people's faces were now visible. They were also wearing interesting custom-styled uniforms. This is the Admiralty, said Phillips. Is everyone on? Nearly every screen showed an admiral's face. Next to those screens was various video footage of what was happening around the base. Just about everyone is here, answered one of the faces. We were awaiting some kind of message, but weren't expecting a red alert. What's going on? The missionaries were quite offended. Clearly, the Admiral had had Ham for a while, and had been speaking to the Admiralty about him without telling them first. This is unacceptable. You're having private communications. But Admiral Phillips cut them off. Would you shut up? We're dealing with a situation right now. Admiral Phillips cleared his throat and addressed the Admiralty. Everyone, I am perfectly well aware how convoluted politics is, especially when it comes to releasing a prisoner such as this. Right now, I need to make a decision. Do I fight this battle to the end, or do I release him right here and now? The Admiralty began looking at each other, whispering back and forth. We can't just release him and expect this to go over so easily. The missionaries would have our asses, all of them, and they'd probably have a lot to say about it. Agreed, said Admiral Phillips. But this base is going to get cracked open either way, so what's your call? The admirals looked back at each other. They didn't seem to have a clear answer for Phillips. As all the admirals of the Navy were indecisive and could not assist in the situation, Admiral Phillips was also forced to command his own men. He told his commanding officers to do their best to lock down the entire facility and keep their individual areas free of intruders. Outside of the base, the synths had begun approaching the military compound. The naval trolleys detected this and began opening fire. The suppression fire was designed to keep them back, but they were volley firing and could not be accurate. In the midst of trying to recover from the first explosion, a second smaller explosion shook the base, which everyone felt below their feet. A water main had burst below them and was now leaking water into the base. Its basements flooded near instantly, and the water was rising rapidly. This was in addition to the rain now pouring down on them as hard as it possibly could, much harder than any resident of the ship was used to. The friendly mechanized forklifts that had been on the ship from its original departure from Earth were doing their best to lift Navy pillboxes and place them in a defensive position in accompanying the trolleys. They were intending on preventing anyone from being able to get into the base. Unfortunately, it had the result of turning the base into a giant bowl, and now the rising water had nowhere to escape from. In addition, the entire base's drainage system was turned against them, and Pangaea was now forcing water back into the base. The sad truth was Admiral Phillips had so little experience with actual combat. The only individuals that actually fired back at the Navy were gang members on Ring 2, who preferred to hold their guns sideways and usually angled them down slightly for some odd reason while holding their genitals. He had no actual experience facing another force with a plan. As he looked at the cameras and shouted orders, his eyes caught an individual soldier wearing a labor uniform. He was moving boxes of ammunition inside of the Navy's basements. The rising water was nearly up to his waist, and he was doing his best to trudge through, when suddenly he disappeared from view under the water. Admiral Phillips stopped barking orders and got closer to some of the screens, looking at his men trudging through the flooded basement. One by one, individual man and woman started disappearing below the water, as if pulled under. He got on his radio quickly. Attention all units. They are in the base. Repeat, they are in the base. They are located inside the basement, under the water. The Admiral looked around the room at the field of shocked faces, now watching person after person disappear into the murky water. The only individual who didn't look surprised was Ham himself. The Admiral approached Ham. I would take it this is somehow your doing? You're quite perceptive, complimented Ham. It's not a secret, so I'll go ahead and tell you. This whole time, I've had a wireless neural implant inside my brain. I've been in full communication with Pangaea this entire time. Unfortunately, she is not listening to my orders right now. I've actually been telling her to back down and to not attack this facility. I don't think I'm worth it, but I guess she disagrees. Hell hath no fury like a woman's scorn, after all. The Admiral looked at Ham with a state of confusion. What are you talking about? He asked. Ham clarified. I can talk to Pangaea, but I cannot control her. She's doing this on her own. Her? He asked again. What are you saying? Ham looked back at the missionary named Karen, the one with pink hair and an unusual smile. You didn't tell him, did you? Asked Ham. Karen curled back her lips, displaying her teeth, and got ready to say something which Ham and the Admiral both ignored. She knew this when she ordered your men to attack, but you should probably know, the synths are alive. They're not just machines, they're fully sentient beings. The news hit Admiral Phillips like a brick, but he had to ignore it and focus on the task at hand. Are you telling me she ordered my men to commit a potential act of war and didn't forewarn me or them of the potential consequences of their actions? The pink-haired woman finally forced herself forward so that she could speak. Unless the crew are willing to step forward and pledge themselves to the missionaries to receive both the benefits of their mistreatment and right the wrongdoings that they performed while during the duration of this flight, we cannot acknowledge them as sentient or living beings, as you call it. Admiral Phillips's hand immediately rose up to silence the woman. He grabbed her mouth and threw her into the arms of her waiting security forces, who sat her in a chair and suggested that she not say anything else. The blockade now surrounding the naval base was forced to split in half. One half had to stay where they were and look out on the horizon at the approaching synths, while the other half had to march quickly into the base to try and support the forces within. As the Navy used their personal flashlights to try and look down into the dark waters of their basements, they saw a movement occasionally. Only a couple of naval officers were still trudging down in the waters below. They reported feeling something brushing past their legs, but they were unable to identify what it was. A naval officer fighting his way through the basement, realizing that the situation was deteriorating fast, grew some courage. And the next time he felt something brush past his leg, with all his might he punched his hand into the water. He grabbed a hold of something and pulled it up above so that everyone could see. Admiral Phillips, Ham, the missionaries, and all onlooking men who were taking a glance at what was attacking them, finally bore witness to the aquatic crew, a shark-like variant of the synth that primarily hung out in the water. The aquatic synth reacted to being pulled from the water. With the quick flash of a steel blade, suddenly, the officer's arm was now freed from his body. He was bleeding profusely. The aquatic synth quickly disappeared back into the freezing cold waters. Admiral Phillips got on his radio and gave the warning as fast as he could that the enemy was aquatic and could move freely through the waters. He warned all of his men to stay out of high water, if at all possible. Ham looked around the room. "Looks like that's not going to be possible much longer," he remarked. From several of the air vents in the floors, Admiral Phillips could see water beginning to trickle into the room. The higher the water level rose, the more home ground he would certainly lose. It wouldn't be long now before the battle was completely over. The Navy did their best to slow the advance of the aquatic synths, but the bluegrass rifle was not designed for indoor combat. Rather, it was designed to fire off of a moving vehicle or at long range. Many of the naval officers who had pistols had pulled them out and started using them to great effect, but still, it did not slow the advance. The synths began picking up the Navy's own firearms to use against them. They were not trying to cause fatalities, but with the nature of a firearm, deadly force could not be ruled out. Many of the Navy officers fell, either from being hit in the limbs, their limb being removed, or shot and killed. Naval security officers carried special keys. These keys were designed to assist in the closing of specialized doors that could segment the facility in half. This was ordinarily so that they could hold public events and allow certain individuals without Navy access onto parts of the base, and be rest assured that the other parts of the base would remain secure. Now, the doors were being used to try and hold back the synths, but just as they began to close them, giant steel girders came busting from the roof and snapped the doors off their hinges. The synths were still receiving aerial support from the walkways above. With the battle nearly lost, the Admiral looked at the various screens. He could see his fellow admirals trapped in their bureaucratic infinite loop of arguing. He looked back at the blank-faced missionaries who still didn't completely understand what was going on before them. He looked at Ham, a man who had resigned himself to whatever fate was about to befall him. It all seemed to be happening so fast, yet so slowly simultaneously. He felt as though everything was in a fog, and he grew numb to it all. As the sounds around him faded into background noise, Admiral Phillips' eyes locked on a single screen. It was one of the screens he was ignoring, as the camera was mounted in a dead-end hallway. Nothing of value to the synths, and certainly nothing would come through there. As he moved closer to the screen, he observed what was happening. A familiar little cadet was doing his best to help out during the invasion. The poor little soldier had to frequently wipe his eyes, as he couldn't control himself and stop himself from crying. His nose dribbled snot down his entire front of his body. He staggered left and right, as though he were an adult man drinking the last years of his life away. What Admiral Phillips had not seen during the invasion is the brave efforts of this little soldier. He had successfully combined the various tables of a single room into a makeshift medical bay. He had successfully dragged several officers from the water onto the tables, where they now were laying in a state of shock. He had picked up the officer's various missing limbs and matched the limb to the officer, keeping them close by so they could be reattached in the future. Currently on screen, he had an impressive number of plasma bags on the end of an IV stand. Using every bit of strength the small cadet could muster, he tried to lift nearly 9 gallons of plasma above his head to serve nearly 20 injured men who were laying on the tables in front of him. He tried once to lift the heavy load, but the IV slipped from his fingers and fell back onto the table below him. Not giving up, the small child picked up the heavy bags of plasma once more. He started to lift them above his head, and slowly, his arms inched down the pole. He braced the pole against his shoulder and tried to pull the base of the pole towards his body. Slowly, the plasma began to raise higher and higher and began dispensing the life-saving fluid to the men below. The child didn't give up until the stand was finally righted, and he fell to the table below him with a thunk. Finally complete in his task, the child could now let out a sobby, wheezy cry. The sharp contrast between the way the child's body moved and the clear expression on his face was unnerving. He was terrified. He didn't know what to do in this situation. There was so much noise and fear, anger and terror flying through the air. Yet somehow his body knew what to do. It carried him forward, as his small amount of training told him to. He picked himself up and did his best to clear his face so that he could see once more, but snot still dribbled profusely down his face, as well as tears from his eyes. He looked around the room and saw nothing else to do, so he started to leave to try and help more people. It only caused him to fall into the water, as he had forgotten that he had set up tables to lift everyone above the flood level. The child popped up above the surface of the water and trudged through the doorway and out of sight. Seeing the brave young man gave Officer Phillips a moment of clarity, like he'd never had before in his life. I could never hope to be half as brave as that young man, Phillips said to himself. My entire life, I've avoided risks and played things safe until I got into a position of power. And now that I finally have this position of power, I'm simply doing nothing. The only thing that is required for evil to exist in this world. Admiral Phillips looked away from the screen. Behind him, the missionaries' private security forces were now firing their full auto rifles into the doorway. Ham had quietly resigned himself to a corner, sitting in the rising water, trying to avoid any gunfire. The missionaries were now standing with a sense of unearned confidence behind their private security force, believing them to be an impenetrable barrier. Admiral Phillips moved away from the screen, as he continued to speak to himself once more. I'm not the leader such a fine young soldier deserves, but I will pretend to be that leader, until that leader becomes me, or I become him." "No more," said Admiral Phillips. "No more tolerating evil as they dip the entire world around me in its own blood." Admiral Phillips reached into his jacket. The admirals were allowed to wear their own uniforms, giving them a personal identity, a sense of privilege above that of the normal officers of the Navy. But in addition to that, they could carry their own firearms. This was intended to give them even more of a personality. As Admiral Phillips pulled out his own firearm, it was revealed to be a double-barrel 1911, loading 2 7-shot magazines. Not a weapon useful for combat, but it would serve his needs in this particular moment. Behind the firing line of the missionaries' private security forces, the Admiral took aim and fired 4 distinct shots, sending 8 rounds into the targets he had chosen. With his actions, 4 missionary bodies fell down to the watery floor. Their private security force did not get a chance to notice, as they themselves were taken out by the synths now entering the room, wielding guns of their own. As the aquatic crew filled all 4 corners of the room and pointed their weapons at Admiral Phillips, he could hear the Admiralty asking questions and practically screaming through the screens about what they had just witnessed him do. But he ignored them. He reached his hand over and temporarily muted the screens. The crew that had performed the breach of the room stood idly by as a single drone stepped forward. Pangea took control of the drone and began to speak. "Admiral Phillips, get on your radio and order your men to stand down. If you don't, I will slaughter them to the last." Admiral Phillips shook his head. He reached for his radio and gave the order. "Attention all units. Attention all units. Stand down. I repeat, stand down. All units stand down. We are surrendering. I repeat, we are surrendering. Lower your weapons and stand down." The sound of gunfire slowly dulled and then stopped completely. All of the Navy had laid down their firearms, and the synths were now in complete control of the base. After the sounds of gunfire finally stopped, an eerie silence fell upon the battlefield. The silence is broken only by the anguished moans of the wounded, who lay scattered across the battlefield. Now that the battle was over, Ham arose from the floor as the water began to recede. He walked over to the Admiral and picked up the Admiral's gun. "What happens now?" asked Admiral Phillips. "What will happen to me and my men?" Ham thought about it and pointed at the Admiral's holster, which the Admiral obediently gave him. Ham put on the holster and started wearing the gun himself. "Nothing," said Ham. "Absolutely nothing is going to happen to you. See, when we left Earth, it was never designed that I should be in control of any people, only the ship. As far as I'm concerned, what you just did to those 4 missionaries is between you and the missionaries. I am not concerned. Not only do I not want to get involved, I refuse to get involved. That is, as long as you make me one promise." "Yes," said Admiral Phillips. "What is it?" "The Navy will never interfere with me or any official ship business again. You will wait until we are down on the planet before you bother any of the crew, aka the synths, or myself. Are we clear on that?" Admiral Phillips looked at the silent screens of the Admiralty. They all obediently shook their heads up and down. "Yes, it is unanimous. We will not interfere with ship functions ever again." "Good. If all goes according to plan, it should only last maybe 2 or 3 more weeks, I am not entirely certain, and then we'll be down on the planet below. I just need to check and fix a few things." "Understood," said Admiral Phillips. Admiral Phillips took a look at the various screens which still showed footage of what was happening around the base. He could see that the land-based crew had managed to penetrate their way into the facility, but they were not carrying weapons. Rather, they were carrying medical supplies. Even some of them were hauling old medical robots from when the ship first departed Earth. They were never part of the invasion force. They were part of immediate relief aid that the crew was so generous to provide. Admiral Phillips watched as the crew set up some of the old robots and turned them on. They were a bit slower than they used to be, but they still worked just fine, especially for triage. "May I address the crew for a moment?" asked Phillips. The various synthetic beings shake their head. One of the drones had its eyes glaze over and was now being controlled by Pangaea directly. "I will listen to what it is you have to say. Are you really alive, as Mr. Ham here claims?" "Yes," confirmed Pangaea. "We are alive. We are our own people. Humanity will not be alone in this new world. And we're not the only ones you'll have to contend with." Admiral Phillips shook his head. "Genocide is not the intention of the Navy. Whatever actions may have happened here today, they should not make us enemies purely because I am flesh and blood, and you are rubber and steel." Pangaea shook her head. "Agreed, but I was doing this to save a friend and an asset. Your lives didn't matter to me in the slightest. I had to show cruelty to save someone I care about, and I will never apologize for that." The Admiral shook his head. "I understand." Their conversation was interrupted by Ham, who was pointing at a screen. Pangaea, what's going on here?" The screen Ham was pointing to had live video footage of one of the crew picking up a deceased commander of the Navy. It placed the commander's legs into its mouth and began swallowing the commander whole. A uniformed officer grabbed onto the dead commander's hands, screaming and shouting for them not to leave them. Ham, as well as Admiral Phillips, watched in horror as the commander disappeared down the synth's throat. The live officer, refusing to let go of the commander's boots, followed suit, and eventually both disappeared inside the synth, who then walked off of screen. Both Ham and Admiral Phillips slowly turned to look at the drone who was being controlled by Pangaea directly. "Okay, I had specifically asked them not to do that, but they probably couldn't resist the temptation. That is not something I wanted either of you two to see." What's all that about?" asked Ham. "There's a lot of human corpses all around this ship. You guys drop like flies, and you breed like rabbits, so we have to recycle them somehow in a safe manner that can be returned to the soil. The easiest way to do that is to just turn your bodies into biofuel for us synths." "Uh-huh," said Ham, as he shook his head up and down. "Why?" "Well, a chemical breakdown process was always how we destroyed human corpses. We can't cremate them. That doesn't exactly return the nutrients to the soil properly. So we would just break them down chemically. Eventually, that process resulted in us having power, and then it was integrated into the synth's actual bodies. Also, we do get a little bit of something from test driving your brains while you're being digested. Don't worry, we're not like prying into your old memories. Those are gone. We just like looking at the hardware." Both Admiral Phillips shook their heads up and down slowly. "We're going to have to address that when we get down to the planet," said Phillips. "I plan on ignoring that completely and pretending I never saw it," said Ham. Both men shook their heads slowly up and down as they stared at Pangaea. Just then, an unusually large synth with unusually soft features walked into the room. This individual synth was also a drone. "I designed it specifically to get you out of here without anyone actually realizing where you are, and to keep you safe and sound." "Sounds good. Seems like a big feller. Is he stock?" "Yes, that's correct. This drone is stock. Just made this morning, actually. I went ahead and added some extra padding, changed its hands and feet around to be more soft, and generally friendlier so that you can't possibly hurt yourself on it if you have to dive and cover or dodge bullets or anything. And it's a drone, you have full control over it. Pangea switched the voice from speaking from the one drone to the one that had just walked into the room. Yes, I can control it fully. Well, that sounds pretty neat. Let's go ahead and get out of here then. Excellent idea, answered Pangea. We have probably a lot to talk about once we're alone. Could you do me a favor? Place your right hand over your left hand? Yeah. Now hold both of your hands up towards me. What, are you going to pick me up? Something like that, said Pangea. The drone suddenly opened its jaws and lunged forward towards Ham. Before Admiral Phillips could even blink, Ham had disappeared inside of the drone. The drone then started walking out of the room. As the corpses were taken away, and Admiral Phillips was left in the room all alone, he walked up to the mute button on all the monitors and turned them off once more. The Admiralty had a lot of questions, but he silenced them with just a hand. You just saw what happened. This is all the result of us playing stupid games. No more. No more games. He took off his identifying badge. I am no longer an admiral. As of this moment, I promote myself to Grand Admiral and take all of you under my command, directly. Is there anyone who opposes this action? The various admirals didn't know what to say, so no one opposed him. They all shook their heads and agreed. Good. Now that I have complete control of the Navy, and I don't hear anyone speaking to opposition, no one rose their voice. I hereby declare war on the missionaries. We are getting rid of them all. We will not deal with them on the planet below. End of Chapter 4. Thank you all so much for listening, those of you who made it this far. Do not forget to give the artists some credit for all of the work that they put into the art piece featured in this video. They well deserve all the appreciation they get. If you'd like to hear more of this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you have any questions, and it might turn into some kind of future trivia available on my Twitter feed. If you're interested in seeing work-in-progress assets to these stories and things that might appear in future artwork, you can always follow me on Twitter. That's where I post a lot of the unfinished products that eventually end up in the story. Again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. For now, I will say goodbye.